The red dust was a living thing. It coated the tongue, settled in the lungs, and painted the world in a shade of rust and regret. From her seat inside the rattling stagecoach, Eliza Hart watched it swirl across a landscape cracked and thirsty under the white-hot New Mexico sun. The year was 1878, and the earth itself seemed to have given up, baked into a hard pan that promised nothing but more heat and more dust. The Santa Fe Trail, a artery of commerce and desperation, cut through this land, busy with the ghosts of tomorrow, cavalrymen with sun-squinted eyes, prospectors whose dreams had already been ground down to grit, and traders whose smiles never quite reached their eyes. Eliza clutched the handle of her worn carpet bag, the only thing in the world that was truly hers. Inside, a change of clothes, a small book of poems, and the last of her money. She was 22, and she was running, not from the law, but from whispers. Whispers that had started back east, soft as silk, then sharp as glass, cutting her life to ribbons. An untruth, a viciously crafted lie, had unmoored her from everything she knew. So she had come west, chasing the promise of a place where a person was judged by the work of their hands, not the wagging of tongues. Her destination was Redemption Gulch, a name that sounded like a prayer and a joke all at once. Her immediate goal was simple: a job. Any respectable job that would put a roof over her head and food in her belly. Her long-term goal was harder to name. A fragile thing she kept protected in her heart, a life of her own making. Quiet and decent and free. The coach lurched, throwing her against the hard wooden frame. Outside, the jagged mesas looked like the bones of a sleeping giant. This was a land that did not forgive. It demanded strength, and Eliza wasn't sure she had any left. The dust was more than just dirt. It was the physical form of the prejudice she had fled, a stain that seemed determined to follow her, to cover everything. She closed her eyes, imagining a small fire, a hearth, a place of warmth and safety. It was a foolish dream in this heat, but it was all she had. Miles away, hidden in the shimmering heat haze of a high ridge, Ashki Yazi watched the stagecoach crawl below. He was still, a part of the red rock he leaned against, his dark eyes missing nothing. He saw the tired slouch of the horses, the faint glint of a rifle barrel tied to the driver's seat, the way the dust rose and clung to the coach like a shroud. At 28, he had already lived several lives. He had been a warrior for the Dine, his people. He had been a scout for the United States Army, the Bilagana, until their promises turned to ash in his mouth and he saw their respect for the land was no deeper than the furrows their wagon wheels left behind. Now, he was simply a guardian. His purpose was singular: to protect Zebitsai, the sacred canyon of the split rock wings, the heart of his people. He saw the stage pull into the raw gash in the landscape that was Redemption Gulch. He saw a woman get out, small and alone. He noted the way she held her shoulders straight, even as she swayed with weariness. He felt no connection, only a detached observation. She was another piece of the restless world that was pressing in on his own. He looked beyond the town, his gaze tracing the dry riverbeds and the faint lines of animal trails. He saw the survey stakes, new and sharp, driven into the earth far beyond the town limits, inching closer to the lands the treaties had promised were inviolate. He knew who was behind them. He knew the name Hollis, the railroad man who spoke of progress while his surveyors poisoned watering holes. He knew Marshall Burke, the lawman in town whose justice was for sale to the highest bidder. And he knew Roar McKendry, the bounty hunter who rode with Burke, a man who hunted Navajos for sport as much as for profit. The thirst of this land was nothing compared to the greed of such men. Eliza stepped down from the coach and the heat hit her like a fist. Redemption Gulch was a single, wide street of raw timber buildings, a chaotic mix of saloons spilling loud music into the afternoon, a stark white church with a silent bell, and a sprawling general store that seemed to sell everything from flour to coffins. Men stopped and stared. Their eyes, hard and appraising, swept over her, taking in her simple traveling dress, the exhaustion on her face, the fact that she was alone. The whispers had traveled faster than the stagecoach. She could feel them in the air, as thick as the ever-present dust. A woman traveling alone was a curiosity. A pretty woman traveling alone was a target for speculation. She kept her chin up and walked toward the boarding house, her boots sinking into the fine red powder that paved the street. The woman behind the counter had a face like a dried apple. She took Eliza's money without a word, her gaze lingering for a moment too long. Room at the end of the hall, water's extra, a bucket a day. "I'll take it," Eliza said, her voice hoarse. As she turned, two miners standing by the pickle barrel fell silent, but not before she heard the words. "Came in on the noon stage, all by herself," the other man grunted. "Heard she ain't particular about her company. Travels with anyone." The implication was as clear as it was ugly. The lie had found her. Even here, it had changed its clothes, put on cowboy boots and a layer of grime, but it was the same lie. Later, in a room barely big enough for its narrow cot and washstand, Eliza poured a little of her precious water into a basin. It was gritty, but cool. As she washed her face, she looked at her reflection in the cracked mirror. The woman looking back was a stranger, older and harder than the girl who had left Philadelphia. She remembered the reason for her exile, the false accusation of impropriety with a married man, a man of influence whose wife's jealousy had become a weapon. She had been ruined not by a sin, but by the rumor of one. She had refused to be broken by it. She had chosen exile over apology for something she did not do. She looked out the small, dusty window. The sun was setting, bleeding orange and purple across the horizon. The stark beauty of it was painful. This land was as wounded and as proud as she was. It did not offer comfort, only a challenge. Survive me. A profound loneliness washed over her, so vast it felt like the sky itself. But as darkness settled, she saw it. A single, tiny point of light in the distant hills, a campfire. Someone else was out there, alone in the vast, swallowing dark. A small, defiant spark of warmth. The sight didn't make her feel less alone, but it made her feel less defeated. She had water for a day, a roof for a night, and a will that had been tempered in the fire of injustice. It would have to be enough. The campfire belonged to Ashki Yazi. He had found another surveyor's stake, this one hammered into the ground beside a small spring that his people called Horse Drinker. The wood was fresh, the iron head stamped with the railroad's insignia. He pulled it from the earth with a steady, relentless strength. He did not break it. He kept it, a piece of evidence. He had tried to talk to the soldiers at Fort Wingate. He had shown them the treaties, the maps. The officers had been polite, dismissive. They spoke of a changing world, of progress that could not be stopped. They did not understand that for the Din, the land was not a thing to be owned or conquered. It was family. It held the stories of their ancestors and the promise of their children. To cut it with iron rails was to sever a limb. He built his fire small and hot in a Dakota fire hole, so the smoke would be minimal and the light would not carry far. He was one man against a machine of greed. He knew the odds, but the thought of his mother, Atsa, of the elders, of the children in the hidden canyon, solidified his resolve. They trusted him. He would not fail them. As he chewed on a piece of dried venison, he thought of the woman who had gotten off the stagecoach. He had seen the way the men in town watched her, like wolves circling a lone doe. He felt a flicker of something. Not pity, but a shared understanding. This land chewed up the lonely. It ground them down into the red dust. He hoped she had claws. In this place, you needed them. The night was cold, the stars brilliant in the black sky. The wind carried the scent of dust and sagebrush and the distant, troubled dreams of a town called Redemption. The wind that had spent the day stirring the dust now carried a sharper edge. Darkness fell not like a blanket, but like a slammed door. And with it came a storm that was more ice than water. Hailstones the size of acorns hammered against the flimsy roof of the frontier house. A frantic drumming that rattled the windows in their frames. The common room was crowded with stranded travelers. their faces illuminated by the flickering lamplight, their voices a low hum of complaint and anxiety. Eliza had pushed through them, her exhaustion a heavy cloak. The key the clerk had given her was cold in her hand. 2B. The number was a small anchor in the chaotic night. The upstairs hallway was a long tunnel of shadows, lit by a single, smoky lamp at the far end that did little to pierce the gloom. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool, stale tobacco, and something vaguely like despair. The numbers on the doors were faded, the paint peeling away like sunburnt skin. Eliza squinted, tracing the faint outline of a B on what she thought was the second door on the right. Her fingers fumbled with the lock, her body crying out for the simple oblivion of sleep. The key would not turn. Frustrated, she gave the door a slight push. It swung inward with a low groan. She stepped inside, expecting the same cramped, barren space as her own. Instead, the warm glow of an oil lamp filled a room slightly larger, and in the center of that light sat a man. He was shirtless, his back to her, and the lamplight sculpted muscles that were lean and powerful, the color of weathered copper. His focus was entirely on his left shoulder, where he was pressing a damp cloth to a dark, angry-looking wound. He moved with an economy of motion, a quiet competence that was mesmerizing. He must have felt the draft from the open door, or perhaps he simply sensed her presence. He turned his head slowly, and Eliza's breath caught in her throat. It was the man she had seen from the ridge, the watcher in the hills, though she did not know that. What she saw was a face with high cheekbones and a strong jaw, a face that looked as if it had been carved from the very rock of this territory. His dark hair was tied back, and his eyes held a startling stillness. He did not look surprised or angry. A slow smile touched the corner of his mouth, a faint upward curve that held a universe of weary amusement. Eliza froze, mortified. Her hand was still on the doorknob, her body half in, half out of the room. The heat of a deep blush crept up her neck, a humiliating wave of color. She was an intruder, a fool who could not even find her own room. He watched her for a long moment, the silence broken only by the relentless drumming of the hail. Then, his voice, low and with a rough, musical quality, filled the small space. "Guess heaven sent you to me." The words, so unexpected, broke the spell of her embarrassment. She found her voice, though it came out as a stammer. I am so sorry. I thought my room is 2B. The number, it is so dark out there." He looked from her face to the door, then back again. "This is 2D, he said, the smile never quite leaving his eyes. He shifted slightly, and a flicker of pain crossed his features before he mastered it. "If heaven made a mistake, I will not file a complaint." The warmth in his dry wit was disarming. It invited no apology, only acceptance. The tension in her shoulders eased. She should have closed the door and fled, but she found herself rooted to the spot. In his calm gaze, she saw something that resonated with the profound ache in her own soul, a deep, unyielding loneliness. And in her wide, startled eyes, Ashki saw the same thing. He saw a woman who was adrift, as untethered as a tumbleweed, yet whose spirit refused to be broken. It was a look he knew well. He saw it in the mirror of every quiet river. A sudden volley of gunshots from the street below shattered the fragile peace. Shouts followed, raw and angry. Heavy boots pounded on the boardwalk, then slammed into the boarding house. The door to the common room burst open, and a new wave of noise, this one human and dangerous, surged up the stairs. "Check every room," a voice bellowed, a gravelly sound full of whiskey and authority. Burke wants every suspicious native found. There was trouble at the rail line. Ashki was on his feet in an instant, his movements fluid and silent. The calm amusement in his eyes was gone, replaced by a sharp, assessing glint. He reached for his shirt, his gaze fixed on the door. He was trapped. Eliza's mind raced. In 10 seconds, Her entire world shifted. She saw the wound on his shoulder, the weariness in his face, and the quiet dignity that refused to be rushed, even in the face of imminent danger. She saw the man. Not the label the voice downstairs had shouted. The men coming up the stairs were a mob. They were the embodiment of the mindless prejudice that had driven her here. And in that fraction of a second, she chose a side. She moved without thinking, her actions born of pure instinct. She grabbed his arm. His skin was warm, his muscle hard beneath her fingers. "Behind there?" she whispered, pointing to a large, decorative screen in the corner of the room, painted with faded peacocks. "Quickly." He looked at her, a question in his eyes. There was no time to explain. She just pulled, her urgency conveying everything. He did not resist. He moved behind the screen, melting into the shadows just as the door was kicked fully open. A huge, bearded man filled the doorway. He wore a dusty coat and a sneer that seemed permanent. It was Roar McKendry. His small eyes, like chips of ice, swept the room, lingering on the rumpled bed, the wash basin, and finally, on Eliza. "What is going on here?" she demanded, her voice shaking only slightly. She stepped forward, deliberately placing her body between him and the screen. McKendry's sneer widened. "Looking for a Navajo troublemaker? Caused a ruckus down at the rail camp. You seen anyone like that?" Little lady, his gaze was insolent, traveling down her body and back up again. "This is my room," Eliza said, forcing a coldness into her tone she did not feel. "And I have seen no one. Now, if you do not mind, I would like some privacy." He took a step into the room, his presence sucking the air out of it. He sniffed, his nostrils flaring. "Funny, smells like he might be in here." He took another step, his eyes narrowing on the peacock screen. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. She did not move. She met his gaze directly. "Are you calling me a liar?" she asked, her voice quiet but ringing with challenge. Perhaps Marshal Burke would be interested to know his deputies are harassing lone women in their private rooms. For a long moment, they stood in a silent battle of wills. McKendry weighed the trouble of searching against the potential humiliation of being wrong. He saw the fire in her eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw, and he made his decision. He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the floor, just missing the hem of her dress. "Have it your way," he growled. "But if I find out you are hiding something, the marshal will hear all about it." He backed out of the room, leaving the door hanging open. "There is a white woman up in 2D. He yelled down the hall to his men, "Covering for a Navajo." I would wager—" He was gone. Eliza stood trembling, listening to the heavy boots recede down the staircase. Only when the front door slammed shut did she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She sagged against the wall, her legs suddenly weak. Ashki emerged from behind the screen. He moved to the window, peering cautiously down into the street below. After a moment, he turned back to her. The assessing look was gone, replaced by something softer, something akin to gratitude. "They are gone," he said. "For now," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. He walked toward her, stopping a respectful distance away. "You took a great risk for a stranger." "They were a mob," she said simply, as if that explained everything. And in a way, it did. "My name is Ashki Yazi." "Eliza Hart." He gave a slight nod, a gesture of profound acknowledgement. "I am in your debt, Eliza Hart. A debt of this kind is not forgotten by my people." He reached into a leather pouch at his belt and pulled out a small, deerskin bag tied with a strip of sinew. He held it out to her. "For your cough," he said. He had noticed the slight rasp in her voice when she spoke. She looked at the small bag, then up at his face. "Thank you." "Keep your door locked," he advised. "That one, McKendry. He does not forget a face." He picked up his shirt, wincing as he pulled it over his injured shoulder. Without another word, he slipped past her and out the door, disappearing as silently as he had appeared. Eliza stood alone in the room that was not hers. The air still seemed to crackle with the energy of what had just happened. She closed the door and, for the first time, slid the heavy bolt into place. The storm outside began to subside, the hail softening into a steady, hissing rain. But inside Eliza, a different kind of storm was just beginning. She had not found a job, or a home, or even a moment of peace. But in the span of a few heartbeats, in a dark hallway and a stranger's room, she had found something she had not even known she was looking for, a reason to stand her ground. A fragile seed of trust, planted in the most unlikely soil, had just broken through the surface. That night, sleep would not come. She lay on her narrow cot in room 2B, listening to the wind howl, her hand clutching a small deerskin bag of herbs, wondering what in the world she had just done. The Silver Kettle Saloon was the beating heart of Redemption Gulch, and its rhythm was the clink of glasses, the slap of cards, and the low murmur of deals being made and reputations being unmade. Eliza secured a position as a kitchen hand, a job of endless dishwashing, potato peeling, and scrubbing floors slick with grease. The heat from the massive wood-fired stove was a constant, oppressive presence. But the small wage was a lifeline. Silas, the saloon's owner, was a man whose pragmatic nature outweighed his suspicions. He had hired her with a warning. Keep your head down and your opinions to yourself. Miss, this is not a town that takes kindly to complications. His words were an understatement. Eliza felt the weight of eyes on her every time she stepped out of the kitchen to fetch water or empty ashes. The whispers followed her, the same ones that had greeted her at the boarding house, now seasoned with new speculation since the night of the hailstorm. She was the woman who had stood up to Roar McKendry. She was the woman who lived in room 2B, just down the hall from where the law had come looking for a renegade. She was a curiosity, an anomaly, and therefore a threat to the town's fragile, brutal order. She ignored the stares and the hushed comments, focusing on the rhythm of her work, finding a strange solace in tasks that were simple and honest. A few days after she started, the town's attention shifted. Mr. Hollis, the railroad magnate, held a meeting at the town hall. He was a portly man with a smooth, persuasive voice and a waistcoat that strained at the buttons. He spoke of civilization, of progress, of the iron horse that would connect Redemption Gulch to the rest of the nation, bringing prosperity for all. He painted a picture of a future bright with commerce and opportunity, a future that required the taming of the wilderness and the savages who roamed it. The crowd of merchants and miners listened, their faces rapt, their greed stoked by his promises. Eliza, sent on an errand to the general store, paused outside the open doors of the town hall, listening. Hollis's words were like honey laced with poison. He never mentioned the Dine by name, referring to them only as obstacles to be cleared, a primitive problem that his modern solution of steel and steam would inevitably solve. Standing at the back of the room, looking pleased and important, was Marshal Burke. He was the law, but Eliza saw clearly that he was a tool, his badge a convenient emblem for the railroad's ambition. Later that day, from the kitchen's back window, she saw Burke and Hollis walking toward the marshal's office, their heads close together in conspiratorial conversation. They were signing the town's future away, and with it, the future of a people they had never met. A week passed. The work was grueling, but it was steady. One afternoon, as she was shaking a dusty rug in the alley behind the saloon, she saw him. Ashki Yazzie walked down the main street with a purpose that set him apart from the aimless loiterers. He moved with a quiet confidence, his gaze sweeping the street, taking in everything. He was heading for the general store. As he passed the mouth of the alley, his eyes met hers. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a greeting, an acknowledgement, a question. She nodded back, a silent confirmation that she was, for the moment, all right. Later, he emerged from the store with a sack of salt over his shoulder and a coil of new bowstring in his hand. He took the long way around, behind the buildings, avoiding the main thoroughfare. He found her by the water pump. "The work is hard," he stated, not a question but an observation. "It is honest," she replied, her hands continuing their steady rhythm on the pump handle. "The man Hollis," Ashki said, his voice low. "He promises them riches from the land, our land." "I heard him speak," Eliza said. "He speaks of progress as if it is a holy word." "Progress is a hungry god," Ashki said. He looked at her, his eyes serious. "McKendry has not forgotten you." "I have not forgotten him either," she said. There was nothing more to say. Their connection was not one of flirtation or romance. It was a bond forged in shared danger. A silent understanding between two people on the outside of a hostile world. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the heat shimmer rising from the plains as silently as he had appeared. That night, the hammer fell. Eliza was cleaning the last of the greasy pots, her arms aching with fatigue. The saloon was quiet, the last of the drunks having been pushed out into the street. A sudden commotion from the direction of the livery stable made her pause. There were shouts, the sound of a scuffle, peering through the grimy kitchen window. She saw it all unfold in the pale moonlight. Roar McKendry and another man were dragging a horse out of the stable. Even in the dim light, Eliza could see the brand on its flank, a stylized N that marked it as belonging to the nearby army fort. They were not stealing it. They were moving it. Then they dragged a man out of the hayloft. It was Ashki. They threw him to the ground, accusing him loudly of being a horse thief. The stable boy, a skinny youth, tried to protest, and McKendry struck him across the face, sending him sprawling. They tied Ashki's hands and hauled him toward the marshal's office, leaving a different, unbranded horse tied to the post outside the livery. It was a blatant, ugly setup, a piece of theater for an audience of one, the law, and Eliza was the accidental witness. The next morning, the town buzzed with the news. Ashki was tied to the hitching post in front of the marshal's office, a public spectacle. Marshal Burke stood on the boardwalk, a smug smile on his face, enjoying his moment of authority. A crowd had gathered, a mixture of the curious, the vindictive, and the fearful. Eliza walked out of the saloon, wiping her hands on her apron. She pushed her way through the murmuring crowd until she stood before the marshal. "Marshal Burke," she said, her voice clear and steady. He turned, his smile becoming condescending. "Miss Hart, a lovely morning for justice to be served, is it not?" "That man is not a thief," she said, ignoring his tone. A ripple of interest went through the crowd. Burke's eyes hardened. He was found in the livery, preparing to steal a horse. The stable boy is a witness. "The stable boy was hit for telling the truth," Eliza countered, her voice rising slightly. "I saw it. I saw your deputy, McKendry, lead a different horse out of that stable last night. It had an army brand on it. This horse," she gestured to the animal now being presented as evidence, "is not the one they claimed was being stolen." The crowd was silent now, all eyes on her. Burke's smile vanished completely. He stepped closer to her, his voice a low, threatening growl. "You are making a very serious accusation, miss, one that could be considered interference with a lawful arrest. The law is the law. It is not for you to interpret." "And it is not for you to invent," she shot back, her chin high. From the corner of her eye, she saw Ashki. He had been watching, his face impassive. But now, as all attention was focused on her confrontation with Burke, he moved. With a small, concealed blade, he began to saw at the ropes that bound him to the post. It was a desperate gamble, but her defiance had bought him the only thing he needed, a few moments of distraction. Burke, enraged by her public challenge, grabbed her arm. "You are finished in this town. You understand me." Just as he spoke, Eliza saw Ashki break free. He darted for the side of the marshal's office, leaping to grasp the edge of the roof. In a flash, he had pulled himself up. Eliza acted on pure instinct. She let out a cry, stumbling backward as if Burke had pushed her. She fell against a stack of heavy iron pots and pans left outside the kitchen door. They went crashing down onto the wooden boardwalk with a deafening, metallic clangor. Every head in the street whipped around at the sudden, violent noise. Burke! McKendry! The entire crowd, they all turned. It was only for a second, but it was enough. In that second, Ashki scrambled across the low roof of the marshal's office, leaped to the adjoining roof of the general store, and disappeared down into the alley behind it. McKendry let out a roar of fury and started after him, but he was too late. Ashki had vanished into the warren of back alleys and sheds that was the town's underbelly. The escape was as swift as it was audacious. The crowd began to disperse, muttering amongst themselves. Burke turned back to Eliza, his face a mask of cold fury. He said nothing, but his eyes promised retribution. Later that afternoon, Silas, the saloon owner, found her in the kitchen. He looked tired and sad. He stared at the cold, dead ashes in the cook stove. "I have to let you go, Eliza," he said quietly. "I cannot afford the marshal's wrath. You are a good worker, but you bring trouble." She simply nodded. She had known it was coming. She took off her apron and laid it on the clean countertop. She had no job. She had no room, for she could no longer afford it. She had nothing in Redemption Gulch but enemies. Her brief attempt to build a new life here was over. The kitchen fire was out. She packed her meager belongings in her carpet bag and walked out of the boarding house for the last time. She did not know where she was going, only that she could not stay. As she reached the edge of town, the last rays of the setting sun were being swallowed by the horizon. A figure emerged from the deepening shadows of a rocky outcrop. It was Ashki. He stood waiting for her, a silent question in his posture. She did not need to think. Her choice had already been made. Not in that moment, but in the moment she had decided to speak up in the street. To stay was to surrender to the likes of Burke and Hollis. To go with him was to step into a vast, dangerous unknown. She walked toward him as the last of the light faded from the sky, leaving the world in shades of gray. The road ahead was unclear, a path into the heart of the wilderness. She had left one life of whispers behind, only to find herself in a new life of open threats. But for the first time, she was not running away from something. She was walking towards someone. And as the gray dawn broke the next morning, they were miles away. Two small figures moving across the vast, indifferent plain, their journey just beginning. The wilderness did not offer the courtesies of civilization. It had its own rules, ancient and unforgiving. And Ashki Yazi was a fluent reader of its harsh language. For Eliza, it was a text she had to learn page by painful page. The first lesson was in silence and subtlety. He taught her to walk not on her heels, which left deep, clumsy prints for any pursuer to follow, but on the balls of her feet, a lighter, more deliberate step that barely disturbed the sandy soil. He showed her how to use the landscape, to move in the shadows of rock formations, and to choose paths of hard, sun-baked clay that held no trace of their passing. Her education in survival was practical and immediate. Water was life, and he taught her to find it, not in gushing streams, but by looking for the deep green of cottonwood trees that signaled moisture far below the surface. Food was a constant concern. He pointed out the broad, spiky leaves of the yucca plant, showing her how to dig for the starchy root, which they roasted in the coals of their small, smokeless fires. These fires were another lesson. He never built a bonfire that could be seen for miles. Instead, he dug a Dakota fire hole, a narrow pit a foot deep that concealed the flames and directed the heat upward, making it efficient for cooking and nearly invisible to prying eyes. Eliza, who had once considered a missed dinner party a catastrophe, now learned to cherish the gritty, slightly bitter taste of roasted yucca root as the finest of delicacies. Their world shrank to the fundamentals: the rising and setting of the sun, the search for water, the gnawing in their bellies. But in this stripped-down existence, something new began to grow between them, a partnership. They spoke little during the day, conserving their energy. But their communication was constant in the small gestures of shared existence. She learned to anticipate when he needed the water skin, and he learned to read the subtle signs of her exhaustion, calling for a rest in the shade of a lonely juniper before she had to ask. Nature, their provider, could also be their sworn enemy. They saw the storm coming from a long way off. It started not with clouds, but with a change in the light. The brilliant, unforgiving blue of the sky slowly turned a sickly yellow-brown. The wind, which had been a hot, steady breath, began to blow in violent, unpredictable gusts, whipping dust and sand into their eyes. Ashki's pace quickened, his eyes scanning the horizon for shelter. He found it just as the first wall of dust hit them, a shallow overhang on the side of a small mesa, barely deep enough to offer protection. The world outside their small refuge dissolved into a roaring, blinding chaos. The sun vanished. The air became a thick, choking soup of red dust that stung the eyes and grated in the throat. It was impossible to speak, impossible to see more than a few inches. Ashki pulled the kerchief from his neck, soaked it with a precious handful of water from the skin, and handed it to Eliza. Gesturing for her to cover her nose and mouth, he did the same. They crouched low to the ground, backs pressed against the rough stone, and simply endured. It was a terrifying, humbling experience, a reminder of their own fragility in the face of the land's raw power. The storm raged for what felt like an eternity, and then, as suddenly as it began, it passed. The silence that followed was profound. A thick blanket of red dust covered everything, softening the sharp edges of the rocks and muffling all sound. The air was still and cool. They emerged from their shelter into a transformed world, hushed and clean. That night, as they sat by their small, hidden fire, the shared ordeal loosened their tongues. The sky was awash with stars, brighter and clearer than Eliza had ever seen them, undimmed by the lights of any city. Ashki pointed to a familiar constellation. That is Nahukos Bikai, the male revolving one, he said, his voice soft in the vast stillness. And that one, with the long tail, is Jish, the celestial pouch. He spoke the Dine names for the stars, and the ancient stories attached to them, tales of gods and heroes who inhabited the night sky. He was not just naming lights, he was sharing the map of his soul, the cosmology of his people. Eliza listened, captivated. In return, she offered him a piece of her own lost world. I remember the smell of my mother's kitchen in the autumn, she said, her gaze distant. She would bake apple pies, and the whole house would smell of cinnamon and baked apples. It was the warmest, safest smell in the world. She spoke of green grass and rainy afternoons and the particular chime of the clock in her family's hallway. They were small, simple memories, but they felt like treasures she was carefully unwrapping for him. In the firelight, they were not a white woman and a Navajo warrior. They were just a man and a woman, sharing the ghosts of their childhoods under a silent, star-filled sky. Their journey had been hard on Ashki's shoulder. The constant movement and the tension of the escape had inflamed the old wound. One evening, she saw him trying to tend to it, his face tight with pain. Without a word, she took the small deerskin bag he had given her on that first night. She had carried it ever since, a secret talisman. She brewed the herbs in their small tin pot over the fire, the air filling with a clean, pungent aroma. She knelt beside him, the pot in her hand. "Let me," she said quietly. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded, a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. Her touch was clumsy at first as she cleaned the wound with a strip of cloth torn from her petticoat. Her fingers brushed against his warm skin. It was an intimate, practical act, devoid of romance yet filled with a deep and unspoken tenderness. She pressed the warm, damp poultice of herbs against the inflamed muscle. He winced slightly. "You are a harsh nurse," he said, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "It is a harsh world," she replied. her own voice light, her hands surprisingly steady. "You should have been more careful." He looked at her then, his gaze direct and warm. He said, "I was careful enough to run into the right room." The shared memory of their meeting hung in the air between them, a moment of gentle humor that eased the awkwardness of their closeness. A rhythm developed between them, the unspoken cadence of a family. They divided the last of their dried meat without discussion, each ensuring the other received a fair share. They planned their route by the availability of water, their conversations a practical litany of place names and distances. Trust was not a grand declaration. It was built in these dozens of small, daily acts of mutual reliance. It was in the way he would wake in the night to take a turn at watch, and in the way she would have a fire ready for him when he returned. But their fragile peace was not destined to last. One morning, while scouting ahead, Ashki returned to their small camp, his face grim. He said nothing, only beckoned for her to follow. He led her to a patch of soft earth near a dried-up creek bed. There, pressed deep into the dirt, was the clear, unmistakable print of a large, heavy boot. It was a print he knew well, the print of a man who walked with an arrogant, heavy tread, Roar McKendry. The sight of it sent a cold spike of fear through Eliza. The past was not behind them. It was hunting them. "We cannot stay on this path," Ashki said, his voice low and urgent. "He is a good tracker, and he will not be alone." His gaze swept north, toward the distant, hazy line of a river canyon. "We cross the San Juan. The river will wash away our trail." The San Juan River was a churning, angry beast, swollen with recent rains from some distant mountain. It was a torrent of cold, brown water racing between its banks with a sound like a low growl. Standing on the edge, Eliza felt her courage desert her. The current was powerful, and the water looked deep and impossibly cold. Ashki waded in first, testing the depth and the force of the water. It came up to his waist, pulling at him, trying to drag him downstream. He turned back to her, his face set and determined. "It is strong, but the bottom is firm here. We can make it." She took a hesitant step into the water, and the icy shock of it stole her breath. She stumbled on a loose rock, and the current immediately grabbed at her skirts, pulling her off balance. Panic seized her. Ashki was beside her in an instant, his hand closing around her wrist. His grip was like iron. "Look at me," he said, his voice cutting through her fear. "Do not look at the water. Look at me. Step where I step." She forced her eyes away from the terrifying rush of the water and fixed them on his face. She saw no fear there, only an absolute, unwavering focus. She nodded, unable to speak. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to cross. He moved sideways, bracing himself against the current, his body a shield for hers. She followed, her eyes locked on his, her feet finding the same purchase his had just left. It was a baptism by ice and fear. With every step, she felt the life she had known in Redemption Gulch, the life she had known back east, being stripped away, washed downstream by the relentless current. All that existed was the man in front of her, and the desperate need to reach the other side. They collapsed on the far bank, shivering and gasping for air. They were alive. They were across. They were, in a way they had not been before, truly and irrevocably bound together. Their old lives were on the other side of that river. Whatever came next, they would face it as one. That evening, they huddled by a small fire, wrapped in their damp blankets. The wood was wet and hissed and popped, but it gave off a welcome warmth. Eliza watched the flames dance, her mind quiet, her body aching with a profound, cleansing exhaustion. She looked at Ashki, at his strong, tired profile illuminated by the firelight, and a feeling of gratitude so intense it was almost painful washed over her. And then, for the first time since she could remember, a laugh escaped her. It was not a loud laugh, just a small, soft bubble of sound, born of relief and the sheer absurdity of it all. Ashki turned to look at her, a question in his eyes. She just shook her head, a real smile spreading across her face. He watched her for a long moment, the firelight reflecting in his dark eyes. "A laugh like that," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. The storm itself might hesitate. The path to Sebitsai was not a path at all, but a secret whispered by the rock itself. Ashki led Eliza along a narrow, treacherous ledge that clung to the sheer face of a towering red sandstone cliff. Far below, the world they had just crossed was a featureless expanse of dust and scrub. Here, pressed against the warm stone, the air was different, cooler, filled with the faint scent of pine and damp earth. He showed her the ancient handholds carved into the rock, worn smooth by generations of his people. It was a climb that required trust in the stone, in the guide, and in oneself. After what felt like hours of careful, heart-pounding progress, the narrow ledge opened abruptly into a breathtaking vista. The canyon of the split rock wings unfurled before them. A hidden world of impossible green cradled in the arms of the red desert. Terraced fields of corn, beans, and squash followed the gentle slope of the canyon floor. A vibrant tapestry of life. A stream, clear and cool, threaded its way through the fields like a silver ribbon, its gentle burbling the only sound in the vast, peaceful space. Scattered amongst the fields and under the shade of ancient cottonwood trees were the hogans, the traditional homes of the Dini, their earthen, dome-shaped forms looking as if they had grown from the soil itself. It was a sanctuary, a place of profound peace and beauty that felt a world away from the grit and violence of Redemption Gulch. But the peace was for them, not for her. As they descended into the valley, their arrival sent a silent ripple through the community. A woman weaving a colorful blanket on a large loom stopped, her hands stilling in mid-motion. Children playing by the stream fell silent, their dark, curious eyes wide as they stared at the white woman, the Bilagana, who walked beside their warrior, an old man, his face a beautiful roadmap of wrinkles, paused in his task of mending a harness, his gaze steady and unreadable. The silence was not hostile. Not yet, but it was as heavy and solid as the canyon walls around them. It was the silence of assessment, of a deep and ancient caution. A woman of middle years, her bearing regal and her face a stronger, feminine version of Ashki's, emerged from the largest of the hogans. This was Atsa, his mother. She walked directly to her son, her eyes filled with a fierce, relieved love. She placed her hands on his arms, speaking to him in the soft, flowing cadences of the Dine language. He answered in kind, his voice losing some of its hard edge. It was a reunion of deep feeling, but it was a circle that did not include Eliza. Atsa's gaze swept over her, cool and appraising, before she turned and led her son into their home. Eliza was left standing alone, the dust of the trail on her clothes, an alien presence in this perfect, self-contained world. The old feeling of being an outsider, an object of scrutiny and suspicion, settled over her once more. She did not wait for an invitation that she knew would not come. She had learned on the trail that survival depended on action, not on hope. She saw a group of women carrying water in clay pots from the stream. She picked up 2 empty pots that sat by a nearby hogan and walked to the stream, falling into line behind them. They did not speak to her, but they made a space for her. She learned by watching, dipping the pot just so to fill it without stirring up silt. The work was hard, the pots heavy and awkward, but with each trip, she felt she was earning her presence here, one painful step at a time. She saw women washing freshly sheared wool in the stream, and she joined them, her hands plunging into the cold water, scrubbing the lanolin-rich fibers against the smooth river stones. She saw an elderly woman sitting in the sun, her body racked by a dry, persistent cough. That evening, Eliza took a portion of her own small share of cornmeal and made a thin, hot gruel, which she brought to the old woman. The woman accepted it with a grateful nod. But still, no one spoke to her. She was a ghost, performing the tasks of the living. The language was a wall. She listened constantly, trying to parse the flow of sounds, to find purchase in the unfamiliar words. Ashki taught her a few simple, essential terms. "Tu," he said, touching a drop of water. "Water. Ko." He gestured to their small cooking fire. "Fire. Ashki," he said, pointing to a young boy who was watching them. "Boy." A small smile touched Eliza's lips, the first genuine amusement she had felt in days. She looked at him, her eyes twinkling. "So," she said, her voice teasing, "you are the Ashki of the Dain." He looked puzzled for a moment, then understood her play on his own name. A rare, unreserved smile broke across his face. "Sometimes," he admitted, "when my mother is angry with me." It was a small moment, a private joke in a world that offered them little privacy, and it felt like a lifeline. That night, the elders of the community met in council. Ashki stood before them, his voice low and serious as he recounted the story of Hollis and the railroad, of Marshall Burke's false justice and Roar McKendry's relentless pursuit. Eliza watched from a distance, seeing the firelight flicker on the solemn faces of the old men. The chief elder, a man named Hashki, with eyes that seemed to hold the memory of a century, listened without interruption until Ashki was finished. He spoke for a long time, his words carrying the weight of authority and wisdom. Later, Ashki told her their decision. They would not fight. To fight the Bilagana was to invite the army, and that would mean the end of this valley. They would remain here, silent and hidden, for as long as they could. But they would also prepare. They would be ready to leave at a moment's notice, to vanish into the wilderness and become ghosts once more. The decision settled a cold dread in Eliza's heart. She felt the familiar, terrible sensation of being judged, of having her fate decided by others. The people of this valley looked at her and saw the face of their enemy, the embodiment of the world that was pressing in on them. For a dark, desperate moment, she wanted to flee, to run back out into the desert where the judgment was simpler, a matter of sun and thirst. But then she looked around at the quiet dignity of the Hogans, at the sleeping fields, at the faces of the children, and she knew she could not. She had run from whispers once before. This time, she would stand her ground. This time, she would choose to be patient, to endure the silence and the suspicion, and to prove her worth not with words, but with the steady, quiet work of her hands. The turning point came a few days later. The old woman's cough had grown worse. Her breathing was a shallow, painful rasp that echoed in the quiet of the evening. The community's medicine man had given her teas and chanted prayers, but the sickness held fast, watching her. Eliza was struck by a memory. She reached into her carpet bag and pulled out the small, deerskin pouch Ashki had given her in the frontier house. She had saved the last of the herbs, not knowing why. She approached Datsa, who was sitting with the sick woman. She held out the pouch, a silent offering. Atsa looked at the bag, then at Eliza, her expression unreadable. Eliza opened the bag, letting the clean, medicinal scent of the herbs fill the air. She made a gesture toward the fire and the water pot, trying to convey her intent. She wanted to make a steam, an inhalation to soothe the woman's tortured lungs. Atsa watched her for a long, silent moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate nod, she gave her consent. With a profound sense of reverence, Eliza prepared the herbs as she had seen her own mother do long ago for a winter cough. She boiled the water and dropped the herbs in, letting the steam rise, fragrant and potent. She carefully carried the pot to the old woman and, with gestures, showed her how to lean over it, draping a blanket over her head to trap the healing vapor. The old woman coughed and sputtered at first, but then, slowly, her breathing began to ease. The harsh, rattling sound softened, becoming deeper and less labored. A look of profound relief washed over her ancient features. Eliza stayed with her, adding hot stones to the water to keep the steam rising, until the old woman finally drifted into the first peaceful sleep she had known in days. When Eliza finally stood up, stiff and tired, she saw that a small crowd had gathered. They watched her, their expressions no longer cold or suspicious, but filled with a quiet wonder. Atsa met her gaze, and for the first time, there was a flicker of warmth, of respect, in her eyes. She spoke a single word in Dine, a word Eliza did not understand, but whose meaning she felt in the sudden, palpable shift in the air around her. She had not healed the woman, not with any magic. She had simply offered a small bit of kindness, a piece of knowledge from her own world, using a gift from theirs. In that simple act, she had bridged the chasm between them. Later, as she walked by the stream in the twilight, a young girl who had previously fled from her approached her shyly and whispered a name. "Yes, so." Another woman, passing by, repeated it with a small smile. "Yes, so." "She found Ashki by the fire. What does it mean?" she asked. "Yes, so." He looked at her, the firelight dancing in his eyes. "It means white dove," he said, "but it is more than that. It is the name for one who walks between two worlds." A fragile, tentative hope began to bloom in Eliza's chest. For the first time, she felt not like an intruder, but like a possibility. She might have a place here. She might, after all this time, have found a home. But as she looked up at the canyon walls, dark against the star-filled sky, she knew that the world of Burke and Hollis was still out there, its shadow creeping ever closer. The hope was real, but so was the danger. The weeks that followed were a time of fragile peace, a quiet interlude that felt both precious and precarious. Eliza found a rhythm in the canyon, her days filled with the meaningful work of survival. She learned to grind corn into meal, her hands growing strong and calloused. She learned the patterns of the birds and the names of the healing plants that grew in the shade of the cliffs. The children no longer ran from her, and the women now included her in their conversations with gestures and smiles. Their shared work, a language that transcended words. She was Yasso. She was beginning to feel not like a visitor, but like a part of the whole. The peace was shattered by the return of a young scout, a boy named Kea. He ran into the center of the village, his face pale with dust and fear, his chest heaving. He had been posted on the high northern rim, a silent sentinel. What he had seen was the end of their world approaching. He spoke in a torrent of urgent Dine, his words painting a picture that needed no translation. "A pillar of dust," he said, "a slow-moving pillar, not made by the wind. A survey party, and with them, cavalrymen, their blue uniforms and brass buttons glinting in the sun. At their head rode two men. One he did not know. The other he knew by the stories Ashki had told. A big man with a wide-brimmed hat who rode with the arrogance of a conqueror. Roar McKendry. The news fell like a stone into the quiet pool of the community. That evening, the elders convened a council, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows on their worried faces. A wave of angry, fearful energy swept through the younger men. One of them, a hot-blooded warrior named Hastian, leaped to his feet. "We should fight," he declared, his voice ringing with passion. "This is our land. We should meet them at the canyon entrance and show them the strength of Dine warriors." A murmur of agreement went through the other young men. They spoke of a surprise attack, of using the terrain to their advantage. Hashke, the old chief, let them speak. His eyes closed as if in prayer. When they had finished, he opened his eyes, and the firelight seemed to gather in their ancient depths. He rose slowly, his movements deliberate. "To fight is to lose everything," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an undeniable authority. "You speak of one battle. I speak of the war that would follow. If we spill the blood of one soldier, they will send 100. If we kill 100, they will send 1,000. They will come with their big guns that shatter rock. They will burn our fields and poison our water. We have seen this before. Our grandfathers saw it. To fight is to give them the excuse they are looking for. We would win the battle and lose our home, We would win our pride and lose our children. No, we will not fight." His words extinguished the fire of the young men's anger, leaving behind the cold ashes of a terrible reality. But if they could not fight, what could they do? The answer, it turned out, came from an unexpected source. A few days prior, Eliza had been gathering firewood near the canyon entrance, in a secluded spot where a trader named Dawes sometimes left goods for them to find. Dawes was a Bilagana, but he had traded with the Dine for years, a rare outsider who was tolerated, if not fully trusted. As she gathered fallen branches, she noticed a piece of brightly colored twine on the ground, out of place in the natural landscape. Her curiosity piqued. She followed a faint trail of scuff marks in the dirt, leading her behind a large boulder. There, hammered deep into a crevice in the rock, almost completely hidden from view, was a wooden stake. It was new, its top emblazoned with the familiar, hateful insignia of the railroad. Dawes had betrayed them, under the guise of trade. He had been marking their sanctuary for his true masters. She had pulled the stake from the ground and brought it back, a piece of hard, physical evidence of the conspiracy that was closing in on them. Now, in the council, she presented it to Hashke. The old man held the stake in his hands as if it were a venomous snake. The betrayal was a deeper wound than the threat of any army. The news from the world outside only grew worse. Another scout, sent to observe the town, returned with a report that made the blood run cold. Marshal Burke was not just assisting the railroad. He had used the law as a weapon. He had produced a legal warrant, a trat, for the arrest of Ashki Yazi. And the charge was no longer horse theft. It was horse theft and murder. They claimed the stable boy, the one McKendry had struck, had been found dead, and Ashki was the prime suspect. It was a lie, a monstrous, cynical lie, but it was a lie written on an official piece of paper. It gave their hunt the veneer of legitimacy. It turned Ashki from a fugitive into a wanted killer. That night, the tension between Eliza and Ashki finally fractured. They stood by the stream, the sound of the moving water a stark contrast to the turmoil in their hearts. "We must leave," Ashki said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "I will lead the people east, into the Chuska Mountains. We can disappear there." Eliza stared at him, her heart sinking. "Leave, just run." "It is the only way to keep them safe," Ashki insisted. "The warrant, it is not just about me anymore. They will use it as an excuse to come in here, to sweep the canyon. They will say they are hunting a murderer, and they will drive everyone out. If we are gone, they have no reason to come." "I have spent my entire life running, Ashki," she said, her voice trembling with a sudden, fierce passion. "I ran from lies back east, and I ran from them in Redemption Gulch. I am tired of running. If we run now, we are letting them win. We are telling them that their lies are more powerful than our truth." His jaw tightened. "This is not about your pride, Eliza. It is about the lives of my people, the children, the elders. I will not risk them for a principle. And I will not ask you to," she shot back. "But there has to be another way besides fighting or fleeing." "What way?" he demanded, his frustration boiling over. "Do you think you can reason with a rattlesnake? Do you think Hollis or Burke will listen to words? They listen to money and guns." "No," she said, an idea, desperate and half-formed, taking shape in her mind. "They will not listen to us, but they might have to listen to their own people, their own laws." She took a deep breath. "Let me go out there. Let me talk to them." He stared at her as if she had lost her mind. "They will kill you, or worse. They are not just a mob. Ashki, they have cavalry with them. That means there is an officer, a captain or a major, a soldier, not a hired gun like McKendry or a corrupt lawman like Burke. A soldier is supposed to follow rules, to obey orders. He might listen to reason." She was grasping at straws. She knew, but it was better than the suffocating despair of surrender. "Let me be the lamb that stops the wolf pack. If only for a moment, I can buy you time. Time to prepare. Time to hide the women and children in the high caves. Time for something better than running blindly into the desert. He argued, he pleaded, he commanded her not to go. But he saw in her eyes the same stubborn fire he had seen in the marshal's street, the same unyielding resolve. He knew he could not change her mind. The next morning, as the first pale light of dawn touched the canyon rim, she prepared to leave. She dressed in her simple traveling clothes, a ghost of the woman who had first arrived in this territory. As she was about to leave the hogan, Atsa stopped her. Ashki's mother stood before her, her face a mask of solemn dignity. She said nothing. She simply reached out and pressed a small object into Eliza's hand. It was a talisman of worn leather, from which hung a single, perfect bluebird feather, tied with a strand of her own hair. It was not a plea or a command. It was a blessing, an acceptance, a silent acknowledgement that the fate of this family, this clan, now rested in the hands of the outsider she had once distrusted. Eliza clutched the feather, her throat tight with emotion. She could only nod her thanks. Ashki was waiting for her outside. The tension of the previous night was gone, replaced by a grim, shared purpose. He adjusted the kerchief she wore around her neck, his fingers brushing against her skin. His touch was gentle, a stark contrast to the violence they were about to face. He looked into her eyes, and a flicker of their old, dry humor returned, a small light in the overwhelming darkness. "Do not mistake the room again," he said, his voice a low whisper only she could hear. She met his gaze, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. He paused, his own smile wry and fleeting. This time, it would be the wrong army camp. The moment of levity passed, leaving the heavy weight of reality in its place. The time for words was over. He reached out, his hand finding hers, his fingers lacing through her own. Then he pulled her into an embrace, holding her tightly, his arms a circle of strength and fear around her. It was not a lover's embrace, but something deeper, the desperate hug of two souls bound together on the edge of an abyss. He held her for a long moment, a silent promise to a future he was not sure they would share. Then he let her go. She turned and walked toward the narrow path that led out of the canyon, out of sanctuary, and into the teeth of the wolf. She did not look back. The air on the open plain was thin and hot, and Eliza felt as exposed as a lone blade of grass in a fire. She walked with a steady, determined pace toward the distant smudge on the horizon that was the agreed-upon meeting point, a place where a lone butte stood sentinel over the dry prairie. Her heart beat a nervous rhythm against her ribs, but her mind was clear. She clutched the small feather talisman in her pocket, its softness a secret source of strength. She was not alone. She knew Ashki was out there somewhere, a shadow among shadows, his promise to watch over her unspoken but absolute. He was high above her, a silhouette against the morning sun on a rocky ridge to the north. From his vantage point, he saw everything. He saw her small, solitary figure moving across the vast emptiness. And he saw the trap. They were not at the butte. They were waiting for her in a shallow ravine, a place where the earth itself offered cover for an ambush. He saw the glint of a rifle barrel, the nervous flick of a horse's tail. Roar McKendry was there, along with Burke and a handful of cavalrymen, and standing off to one side, away from the dust and the common soldiers, was the railroad man, Hollis, watching the scene unfold with the detached interest of a man observing a business transaction. Ashki needed to warn her, but a shout would give away his position and seal both their fates. He reached into the small pouch at his belt and pulled out a piece of polished obsidian, angling it just so. He caught the bright morning sun and flashed a brilliant, sharp glint of light onto the ground directly in her path. Once, twice, 3 times. It was a signal they had arranged, the flash of a striking snake, a warning of immediate danger. Eliza saw it instantly. Her steps did not falter, but her eyes scanned the terrain ahead. her senses suddenly on high alert. To her left was a small, dense grove of aspen trees, their white trunks clustered together like skeletal fingers. The signal had been a warning, and the grove was the only possible refuge. Without changing her pace, she began to angle her path, moving toward the trees as if it had been her intention all along. She was too late. A voice, rough and triumphant, shattered the silence. "That is far enough, little lady." Roar McKendry stepped out from the ravine, his rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm. He was followed by Marshal Burke and 4 nervous-looking soldiers. McKendry's grin was a slash of yellowed teeth in his dusty beard. "Going for a stroll?" "Were we?" he sneered. "A bit far from your new friends. Are you not?" Marshal Burke stepped forward, unrolling a piece of paper with a flourish. "Eliza Hart," he announced, his voice full of false gravity. "You are under arrest for aiding and abetting a known fugitive and murderer, Ashki Yazi." Hollis remained in the background, a faint, satisfied smile on his face. "I came to speak with the officer in charge of the cavalry," Eliza said, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. "I did not come to speak with bounty hunters or corrupt town marshals." McKendry laughed. "A harsh, ugly sound. The captain is busy. He sent us to collect you. You can tell your stories to him later. Now, you will come with us. Quietly." He took a step toward her, and one of the soldiers, a boy no older than 18, with pale, frightened eyes, raised his Springfield rifle, its muzzle wavering uncertainly in her direction. It all happened in a heartbeat. The world seemed to slow down, every detail becoming sharp and clear. The young soldier's fear, McKendry's predatory advance, Burke's smug certainty. Eliza saw her choices narrow to a single, terrifying point. She could surrender and be swallowed by their lies. Or she could act. Her past life of passive acceptance was over, burned away by the prairie sun and the loyalty of a man they called a savage. She lunged, not at McKendry, but at the young soldier. Her movement was so sudden, so unexpected, that he froze in surprise. She did not try to take the rifle from him. She simply grabbed the long, heavy barrel with both hands, using his own grip as a pivot, with a strength born of pure desperation. She slammed the rifle's stock down onto the hard-packed earth and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening. The rifle bucked, and a geyser of dirt and pebbles erupted less than an inch from the toe of the young soldier's boot. He yelped in shock, stumbling backward, his hands losing their grip. For a critical second, chaos reigned. The other soldiers flinched at the unexpected gunshot. Burke cursed. McKendry roared in fury. In that same instant, a second act of chaos was unleashed. From the ridge above, a dark shape flew through the air. It was Ashki's knife. It did not fly toward a man, but toward the tethers of a pack mule that stood loaded with canvas-covered crates. The blade, thrown with incredible precision, sliced cleanly through the leather straps. The mule, startled by the gunshot and suddenly freed of its restraints, brayed in panic and bolted, charging directly through the group of soldiers. The crates, filled with the railroad's blasting powder, bounced precariously on its back. The soldiers scattered, diving for cover from the four-legged, unpredictable bomb. It was the opening they needed. Ashki was already moving, descending from the ridge with the fluid grace of a mountain lion. Eliza did not hesitate. She turned and ran, not back the way she had come, but toward the aspen grove. She heard another shot, the angry crack of McKendry's rifle, and then felt a searing, white-hot line of pain slice across her left forearm. She stumbled, but did not fall. She pushed through the pain, adrenaline afire in her veins, and plunged into the cool, dappled shadows of the aspens. A moment later, Ashki was beside her, his hand on her good arm, pulling her deeper into the trees. They ran, crashing through the undergrowth, the shouts and curses of their pursuers growing fainter behind them. They did not stop until they reached a narrow crevice between two large boulders, a place so deep and shadowed it was almost a cave. They collapsed into the tight space, their breathing harsh and ragged in the sudden, enclosed silence. The sounds of the world outside were muted, distant. All Eliza could hear was the frantic, desperate pounding of her own heart and the sound of Ashki's breathing, just as labored as her own. He gently took her injured arm. His face was a mask of fierce concentration, his dark eyes missing nothing. The bullet had only grazed her, a shallow but bloody furrow in the flesh. It was a mark, a brand, a physical testament to the choice she had made. The wound was a final, definitive cut severing her from the woman who had once allowed herself to be a victim. Without a word, he tore a strip of cloth from his own shirt. He pulled a small pouch from his belt and sprinkled some dried, crushed leaves onto the wound before binding it tightly. His touch was firm, efficient, yet incredibly gentle. "You did well," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. His work finished, he looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "Very well." She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. The pain in her arm was a dull, throbbing ache, but it was nothing compared to the overwhelming storm of emotion inside her. They were trapped, hunted, and wounded, but they were alive, and they were together. He did not pull away. The space was so small they were almost touching. He raised his hand, not to her wound, but to her face, his calloused thumb gently brushing a smudge of dirt from her cheek. He leaned forward slowly and rested his forehead against hers. In the cool darkness of the crevice, the world fell away. There were no gunshots, no angry shouts, no railroad, no lies. There was only the solid, warm pressure of his brow against hers, the scent of dust and sage, and the faint, clean smell of the herbs on her arm. She closed her eyes, and for the first time, she felt the frantic rhythm of her heart begin to slow, to match the steady, powerful beat she could feel resonating from him. It was a moment of profound intimacy, a connection that went deeper than words, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged between them in fire and fear. A distant shout from McKendry, laced with frustration and venomous promises, drifted into their sanctuary. "He will not stop," Eliza whispered. "I know," Ashki replied, his forehead still pressed against hers. "They will bring more men," she said. "They will come into the canyon tomorrow." He was silent for a long moment. Then he pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. "We will be ready for them," he said. The fear was still there, a cold knot in the pit of her stomach. But looking at him, she knew it was no longer her fear alone to bear, and he, looking at her, knew that his fight for his home, for his people, was no longer a solitary burden. Their feelings for each other, which had been a fragile, unspoken thing, had been tempered in the heat of the confrontation. It now had a name, and a shape, and a promise. It was the promise of standing together. Whatever came next, it was the promise of a shared fate, a path they would now walk as one. They spent the day hidden in the deep shadows of the crevice, a pocket of silence while the world hunted them. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the sky, they knew a decision had to be made. To stay hidden was to wait for the inevitable. To run was to cede the field to the liars. There was only one path left, the one she had started and been forced to abandon. "It is my fight now, too. Ashki," she whispered in the fading light, her voice resolute. "I will not have them call you a murderer. I will not have them take your home because of a lie that started with me." He did not argue. He saw the truth of her words, and he saw the steel in her eyes. He tore a strip of cloth from the cleanest part of his shirt. It was not a flag of surrender, but a flag of parley, a demand to be heard. At dawn, she walked out of the aspen grove and back onto the open plain. She carried no weapon. In her right hand, she held the piece of white cloth, letting it flutter in the early morning breeze. She walked not with the hurried steps of a fugitive, but with the measured, deliberate pace of an envoy. The camp was on high alert. A sentry spotted her immediately, his shouted warning cutting through the quiet morning air. Soldiers scrambled, taking up defensive positions. She saw the young private whose rifle she had fired, the boy with the frightened eyes. He watched her approach, but this time, his expression was not one of fear. It was one of stunned, grudging respect. He did not raise his weapon. She stopped 100 feet from their lines and waited. She did not have to wait long. A man emerged from the largest tent, walking toward her with 2 armed guards. He was a man in his 40s, with a weary, sunburnt face and graying hair at his temples. His blue uniform was dusty, but it was worn with an air of professional authority that set him apart from the likes of Burke and McKendry. He stopped 20 feet away from her. "I am Captain Hayes," he said, his voice tired but firm. "State your name and your purpose." "My name is Eliza Hart," she replied, her own voice carrying clearly in the still air. "I am here to report a crime, several crimes. In fact, and I wish to do so without being shot at by bounty hunters in your employ." Hayes's eyes narrowed slightly. He studied her for a long moment, taking in the makeshift bandage on her arm and the utter lack of fear in her posture. "Bring her to my tent," he ordered the guards. The command tent was an oasis of Spartan order in the dusty chaos of the camp. A simple campaign desk, a folding chair, and a cot were the only furnishings. Roar McKendry and Marshal Burke were already there, looking smug and triumphant. Hollis, the railroad man, stood off to one side, observing the proceedings with a proprietary air. Hayes gestured for Eliza to stand before his desk. "Now, Miss Hart," he said, his voice low and serious, "make your report." Calmly, and without embellishment, she told him everything. She spoke of the railroad's illegal survey parties, of the stakes being driven on protected dine land, of the systematic campaign of harassment designed to force the people from their homes. "Lies," Burke interrupted, his face reddening. "The woman is a known sympathizer. She is protecting a killer." McKendry laughed. "The railroad pays well for clearing out squatters." "Captain, it is a simple matter of pest control. Her word is worthless." The bounty hunter's casual, arrogant admission was a mistake. A flicker of distaste crossed Captain Hayes's face. He was a soldier of the United States Army, not a mercenary for a private corporation. He held up a hand, silencing them both. His gaze returned to Eliza. "You make serious claims, Miss Hart. Do you have any proof?" For answer, Eliza reached into the small satchel she carried. She pulled out the survey stake she had found near the canyon entrance and placed it on the captain's desk with a solid, definitive thud. The railroad's insignia, stamped into the wood, was clear and undeniable. This was driven into the rock not 2 miles from the entrance to their valley. She said, "Well inside the boundaries of the treaty lands. It was placed there by a trader named Dawes. In your pay." She looked directly at Hollis, whose confident smile wavered for the first time. "This proves nothing," Hollis blustered. "A piece of wood." "My men will investigate the location," Hayes said, his eyes still on the stake. He looked back at Eliza. "You mentioned other crimes." She spoke of the fabricated horse theft charge, of how she had witnessed McKendry and his men planting the evidence. She described the warrant for murder, a charge leveled only after Ashki's escape, against a boy who had been knocked unconscious, not killed. Her words hung in the silent tent. McKendry and Burke began to protest, their denials loud and overlapping, but their bluster now sounded defensive, hollow. Captain Hayes listened, his expression unreadable. He looked from the stake on his desk to the faces of the 3 men, and then back to Eliza. He saw the greed in Hollis's eyes, the brutal opportunism in McKendry's, and the weak corruption in Burke's, and he saw the fierce, unshakable conviction in hers. "My goal," Eliza said, her voice dropping, "was to buy 48 hours. Time for the Dine to evacuate the canyon if necessary, to avoid the bloodshed you are about to cause based on these lies. Time for you, Captain, to verify my claims and discover for yourself that you are being used as the private army for a land grab." She reached into her pocket one last time and pulled out a small, folded, and oilcloth-wrapped packet. She carefully unwrapped it to reveal a worn newspaper clipping. "There is also the matter of the law. Captain," she said, placing the clipping on the desk beside the stake. "The Indian Appropriations Act of 1851 makes it a federal crime to trespass on tribal lands that have not been ceded by treaty. To my knowledge, no new treaty has been negotiated with the Dain of Sebitsai. Your presence here, at the request of Mr. Hollis, is in violation of federal law." A muscle tightened in Hayes's jaw. He picked up the clipping and read it. He was a soldier, a man who understood law and the chain of command. Eliza had not just appealed to his conscience. She had challenged his adherence to the very laws he was sworn to uphold. She gave a small, wry smile. "When I fired that rifle yesterday, Captain, I did not shoot at any of your men. I shot the ground. I figured after all this, the ground itself deserved to have its say." A long, tense silence filled the tent. Captain Hayes folded the newspaper clipping and tucked it into his breast pocket. He stood up, his decision made. "Sergeant," he called out. The tent flap opened and a soldier entered, saluting crisply. "Place Marshal Burke and Mr. McKendry under guard in their tent. They are to be considered material witnesses in a federal inquiry. They will speak to no one." "Understood." The sergeant's eyes widened slightly, but he did not hesitate. "Yes, sir." Hayes then turned to Hollis, his voice cold as iron. "Mr. Hollis, your survey party is to cease all activity immediately. You and your men will remain in this camp until I receive further orders from Fort Wingate. You are not to leave." Hollis's face went pale, then purple with rage, but he knew better than to argue with a military command. He gave a stiff, angry nod and stalked out of the tent. Finally, Hayes looked at Eliza. His expression was a mixture of weariness and a grudging respect. "Miss Hart, for your own safety, you will remain here, under my protection. You will be given an officer's tent and a guard will be posted outside. You are a witness in a federal matter now." She had won. She had bought the time she needed, and more. But as the guards led a sputtering, furious Burke and a dangerously silent McKendry away, she knew the price of her victory. She was a prisoner, albeit a comfortable one. As she was escorted to a small tent at the edge of the camp, her heart was not in the camp, but miles away, in a hidden canyon with a man who was waiting for a sign. That night, she could not sleep. She stood at the flap of her tent, looking out at the dark, hulking shapes of the distant mountains. She worried for Ashki. She worried for the people in the valley. Had her gamble paid off? Or had she only delayed the inevitable? And then she saw it. On the highest, darkest peak, a tiny spark of light appeared. It glowed for a moment, then vanished. It appeared again, vanished. A third time it glowed, a tiny, defiant star in the vast, swallowing darkness. It was his signal. 3 flashes. It meant, "I am safe. I am watching." A wave of profound relief washed over her, so powerful it made her knees weak. But she also understood the unspoken part of the message, the urgency carried on the night wind. He was safe for now. The people were safe for now. But their time was running out. "Do not be slow." The flashing light seemed to whisper across the miles. "Do not be slow." 2 days passed in a state of suspended animation. Eliza was treated with a formal, distant courtesy by the soldiers. She was fed. Her wound was checked by a young corporal with a rudimentary knowledge of medicine. But she was a prisoner nonetheless. On the morning of the 3rd day, Captain Hayes summoned her back to his tent. His face was grim, but the hostile edge was gone from his eyes. "A rider arrived from Fort Wingate an hour ago," he said without preamble. "My report has been received. A full investigation is being launched into the activities of the Transcontinental Railroad Company in this territory." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Hollis has been recalled. Marshal Burke is being relieved of his duties. pending the inquiry. As for McKendry, he will be transported to the fort to answer for the death of the stable boy in Redemption Gulch. It seems your testimony has been corroborated." A wave of relief so profound it was dizzying washed over Eliza. "It is over?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The immediate threat is," Hayes conceded, "but men like Hollis have powerful friends. This is a reprieve, Miss Hart, not a final verdict. For now, my orders are to cease all operations and withdraw. You are free to go." He assigned 2 of his men to escort her back to the edge of the canyon lands. A gesture of protection she knew was also a way of ensuring she went straight back to the dine and did not cause any further trouble. As she rode away from the camp, she did not look back. Her face was set toward the red cliffs, toward the hidden entrance to the only place that had ever felt like home. Her return to the canyon was nothing like her arrival. As she and Ashki, who had met her at the trail's entrance, walked into the valley, a cry went up from the children playing by the stream. They ran toward her, their initial shyness forgotten, their small hands reaching out to touch her, their dark eyes wide with a mixture of awe and relief. They chattered excitedly in Dine, and she heard the name they had given her, Yasso, repeated like a joyful refrain. The adults' welcome was quieter but no less profound. The women stopped their work to nod and smile. Their faces softened with a warmth she had never seen before. The men, who had once regarded her with suspicion, now met her gaze with respect. Atsa came out of her hogan and stood before her. She did not embrace her, for that was not her way, but she placed a hand on Eliza's uninjured arm, a gesture of profound acceptance that spoke more than any words. She had left as an outsider, a desperate gamble. She had returned as one of their own. That night, the entire community gathered in the central clearing. A great fire was lit, its flames leaping high into the darkness, sending sparks dancing toward the brilliant, star-dusted sky. They sat in a large circle, the firelight warming their faces, a silent, powerful sense of unity binding them together. Hashke, the old chief, rose to his feet. He did not speak loudly, but his voice, weathered and resonant, carried to every person in the circle. He looked at Eliza, his ancient eyes seeming to see into the very heart of her. "A mother coyote will fight the mountain lion to protect her pups," he began, his gaze sweeping around the circle. "A mother eagle will dive into the storm to shield her nest. A mother bear will face the hunter's gun for her cubs." His eyes returned to Eliza. "A mother's heart has no color. It knows nothing of the language of men or the borders on their maps. It knows only one thing. It knows only how to protect life. Yes, so, you have shown us the heart of a mother. You have protected this family." A low murmur of assent went through the crowd. In that moment, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the quiet strength of these people, Eliza felt the last of the old wounds, the ones carved by whispers and lies back east, finally begin to heal. The ceremony was long, filled with chants and stories that celebrated survival and community. When it was over, and the people began to drift back to their hogans, Ashki led her away from the dying embers of the fire to a quiet spot near the stream. The night air had grown cold, and she shivered slightly. He disappeared for a moment into his family's hogan and returned with a heavy, soft buffalo robe, which he draped carefully over her shoulders. The warmth of it was immediate, a comforting weight that smelled faintly of wood smoke and of him. He stood before her, the starlight illuminating the strong lines of his face. He did not speak, but reached out and pulled her gently into his arms, wrapping the robe around them both. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the slow, steady beat of his heart. They stood like that for a long time, in a silence that was more profound than any conversation. It was a silence filled with gratitude, with relief, and with a deep, unspoken understanding. He tilted her chin up with his hand, his touch gentle. He looked into her eyes, and she saw in them a reflection of the stars, and a warmth that was more powerful than any fire. He lowered his head and kissed her, It was a soft, tender kiss, a kiss of promise, not of passion. It was a question and an answer, a beginning and an end. When it was over, he rested his forehead against hers, just as he had done in the darkness of the crevice. They stayed like that, two people who had found their center in a world determined to tear them apart. A small, tremulous smile touched her lips. "This time," she whispered, her voice teasing. "I did not mistake the room." A low chuckle rumbled in his chest. He pulled back, his hands still resting on her shoulders, his gaze holding hers. "Eliza Hart," he said, his voice soft but sure. "Whichever room you stand in, that is home." The lightness of the moment faded, replaced by the quiet gravity of all they had endured and all they still faced. "Ashki," she said, her voice serious now, "if it is not safe here, if the people must leave." He stopped her, his fingers gently pressing against her lips. "If we must leave," he said, his voice a solemn vow, "I go with you." She covered his hand with her own. "And if we can stay," she replied, her own promise just as absolute, "I will stay with you." In that moment, under the vast, silent canopy of the desert sky, they sealed their pact. It was a pact not just of love, but of partnership, of a shared future, whatever it might hold. She was no longer Eliza Hart, the disgraced woman running from her past. She was Yastso, a woman who had found her strength and her purpose. And he was no longer Ashki Yazi, the lone, hunted warrior. He was a man who had found an ally, a companion, a heart that beat in time with his own. In the days that followed, a new energy filled the canyon. It was the energy not just of survival, but of building. They talked of the future, their plans taking shape in the quiet conversations of the evening. "We could start a trading post," Eliza suggested one night. "A fair one. We could trade the women's beautiful blankets and the men's silverwork for salt and flour and tools, without men like Dawes to cheat them. And we could teach the children," Ashki added, his eyes alight with the idea. "You could teach them your alphabet, your numbers. I could teach them the old stories, the ways of our people. They will need both worlds to survive what is coming." The hope was a tangible thing, a steady flame that warmed them against the lingering chill of the unknown. They knew Captain Hayes had given them a reprieve, not a permanent victory. Men like Hollis did not simply give up. His petitions and his money were likely already making their way to Washington, his arguments for progress and profit finding sympathetic ears. The law was a shield, but it was a shield that could be broken. Justice was not yet won, but for now, in the sanctuary of the canyon, they had each other. They had a community that had embraced them, and they had a future to fight for, together. The cloud was still on the horizon, but for the first time, they were not afraid of the storm. They would face it, side by side. The quiet that descended upon the canyon in the following weeks was different from the tense, watchful silence that had preceded it. It was a breathing space, a time for the collective heartbeat of the community to slow to a peaceful, steady rhythm. The immediate danger had passed, but a sense of uncertainty lingered, a question mark hanging in the clear desert air. The victory Eliza had secured was one of legal maneuvering and fortunate timing, and they all knew that the world of men like Hollis was persistent and patient. The answer came not as a threat, but as a lone rider, a cavalryman in a dusty blue uniform, carrying a white flag of parley. He did not attempt to enter the canyon, but waited at the trailhead where Eliza had first been met by Ashki. Ashki went out to meet him, his posture wary, his hand never far from the knife at his belt. He returned not with a prisoner, but with a letter, its seal bearing the official stamp of the United States Army. They read it together in the soft light of their hogan, the words on the page bringing the final, formal chapter of their conflict to a close. Captain Hayes wrote in a clear, concise hand. His official report, he explained, had been forwarded to the territorial governor. The investigation he had initiated had borne fruit with surprising speed. The testimony of the soldiers, combined with the physical evidence of the survey stake and the railroad's own damningly arrogant paperwork, had been irrefutable. Roar McKendry had been formally charged with the murder of the stable boy in Redemption Gulch and was being held at Fort Wingate, awaiting a military tribunal. As the crime had involved the theft of Army property, Marshal Burke, for his gross abuse of authority and complicity in the fraudulent schemes, had been stripped of his badge and was facing federal charges. As for Hollis, his company was now the subject of a sweeping federal inquiry into illegal surveying and attempts to incite conflict with native tribes. The immediate threat of the railroad, Hayes concluded, had been neutralized. Eliza read the words again, tracing the captain's signature with her finger. It was real. The cumbersome, often unjust machinery of the law had, for once, ground in their favor. Justice had not come from the barrel of a gun, but from the simple, undeniable power of the truth. The news spread through the village not with loud cheers, but with a deep, collective sigh of relief. It was the release of a tension they had lived with for so long it had become a part of their existence. That evening, the fire burned not in council or for ceremony, but simply for the quiet joy of being together, safe in their home. In the months that followed, the promises made under the stars between Eliza and Ashkey began to take root in the rich soil of the canyon. A new marshal in Redemption Gulch, a stern but fair man appointed by the territory, proved willing to establish an honest relationship. A formal trading post was established, not in the town, but at a neutral location a few miles outside the canyon, on a path that soon became known to the Dine as the Trail of Two Hearts. Here, the beautiful, intricate blankets woven by the women and the finely crafted silverwork of the men were traded for flour, salt, coffee, and the sturdy metal tools they needed, all at fair prices, with no tricks and no betrayal. Eliza found a new calling. In the evenings, after the work of the day was done, the children of the village would gather around her. At first, she taught them in the open, with a piece of charcoal on a flat, smooth stone as her blackboard. She taught them the strange, angular shapes of the English alphabet and the simple magic of arithmetic. Ashkey would often sit at the edge of the firelit circle, listening as she patiently sounded out words. And then he would tell them a story, one of the old Dine tales of Coyote the Trickster or the Hero Twins, weaving the two worlds together in the minds of the next generation. Ashkey, in turn, became the undisputed leader of the canyon's guardians. He no longer rode alone. He led the young men on patrols, teaching them not to be warriors of aggression, but to be watchful protectors. He taught them to read the signs of the land, to spot the track of a stranger from miles away, to know the rhythms of the seasons and the secret paths through the mountains. He was no longer a solitary hunter, but a shepherd of his people, his burden now shared, his purpose clear. Their life together settled into a rhythm as natural and as steady as the flow of the stream through the valley. Mornings began with the first light, the air cool and smelling of dust and pine. They would sit outside their hogan, a small pot of coffee brewing over a fire, watching the canyon awaken. The laughter of children chasing goats, the rhythmic thud of an axe splitting firewood, the murmur of women's voices by the stream. These were the sounds of their new life, a symphony of peace. They had forged a family not of blood, but of shared struggle, of mutual respect, of a commitment that had been tested in the fiercest of fires. Inside their hogan, the symbols of their journey found their final resting places. The heavy Springfield rifle, the one she had fired in a moment of pure, defiant instinct, was cleaned, oiled, and hung on two wooden pegs over the doorway. It was no longer a weapon to be used, but a relic, a reminder of the day they had refused to be broken, a fire bell whose alarm had been silenced, and the great, soft buffalo robe, the one he had wrapped around her on the night of the ceremony, now served as their shared blanket, a nightly testament to their warmth and their union, life. like the stream that gave the canyon its heart, flowed on. One evening, they stood outside, watching the last of the sun's fire paint the canyon walls in shades of rose and gold. She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, her arm, now fully healed, leaving only a thin, pale scar as a memento. He looked down at her, a familiar, gentle humor in his eyes. He brushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead. "If you ever mistake a room again," he murmured, his voice a low, teasing rumble, "I hope it is still mine." She looked up at him, her lips curving into a slow, confident smile. "Oh, I know the right room now," she said softly. "I am already in it." He kissed her then, a long, slow kiss that tasted of wood smoke and contentment. The world outside the canyon, with its greed and its politics, was still there. The future was not a promise, but a path to be walked one day at a time. But here, in this small, sacred space, they had built more than a refuge. They had built a life. They had learned that survival was not just about finding water or shelter, but about holding on to one's humanity in the midst of the storm. They had learned that justice, though often slow and hard to find, could be won not with violence, but with courage and truth. And they had learned that love, true and enduring, recognized no color, no language, no border, but bloomed in the most unlikely of places, as resilient and as beautiful as a desert flower after the rain. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the American West. Please comment where you are listening from so we can all connect, and do not forget to subscribe to Wild West Tales, like this video, and press the hype button to help share this story with more listeners.